Hello and welcome to the second lecture for chapter 37. So in this section, we're going to be looking at the course of World War II. So we'll look at the war itself, and this is another example of total war like we'd studied in World War I, right? So in section 2, we're going to look at World War II and how it also is a total war. So as you listen to this, be able to make some comparisons in terms of how the war impacts the societies. So the war begins with a strategy known as blitzkrieg. And a blitzkrieg means a lightning war. And in September of 1939, Hitler launches the first blitzkrieg when he invades Poland. So this is a surprise attack. You send a heavy invasion force supported by air power, right? Airplanes go and bomb just anything in their way. You could see the map here. I know it's kind of difficult to read because one, it's small, and two, it's not in English. But those areas in orange are areas within Poland. And you could see the arrows representing the invasion forces and how from different sides we see the Germans advance into Poland, right, with a heavy force. Those black arrows are the German movements. So that invasion of Poland is the last straw for Britain and France and these other countries, right? Because Hitler promised at Munich that that's all he would take would be the land around Czechoslovakia. So Britain and France declare war on September 3rd. But by the time Britain and France are able to get to the war, Poland was already defeated. Poland falls in 1 month. And Germany and the USSR divided it, right? So while Hitler is carrying this out, the Russians are engaging in their own war, taking the eastern half of Poland. And then what happens between, for the rest of 1939 is known as Sitzkrieg, right? A blitzkrieg is a lightning war. Sitzkrieg means a sitting war, also known as the phony war, because war has been declared, but there's no fighting. The Germans are occupying Poland, but they're not invading anyone else, and the Allies are not invading Poland. They're not sending any troops to fight in Poland. So what's happening in the meantime is that countries are trying to build up their military, devising their military plans, manufacturing weapons, manufacturing supplies that they're going to need. And so that period is known as Sitzkrieg. What does happen is you see the beginnings of the Battle of the Atlantic, right? And this is going to take place throughout the entire course of the war. There's going to be fighting out in the Atlantic Ocean. But on September 3rd, we see the beginning of an Allied blockade of Germany. And that's going to result in German U-boat or submarine attacks on convoys that are coming in from the Americas, mostly from the United States and Canada. So it's the longest continuous military campaign of World War II. So it runs from the beginning of the war, right, September 3rd, when war is declared, all the way until the Nazis are defeated in 1945, right? And so this was announced after the declaration of war. And then Germany subsequently launches its counter-blockade. But other than that, there's not really much fighting going on until 1940. And in 1940, Hitler launches another series of blitzkriegs. And they begin again by going now over countries like Denmark and the Netherlands, the Baltic countries. And then by the spring, France is forced to sign an armistice. So they invade France and they sign an armistice. France surrenders. The northern half of France is occupied by the Germans. And then the rest of France is governed under what's called the Vichy government. That was a puppet government controlled by the Nazis, but it was led by Henri Pétain. And there in that last picture, you see Henri Pétain shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. So he's a French ruler, but he is a puppet. And this is one of the patterns of occupation that the Nazis are going to employ, which is you have puppet leaders who think they're in charge, but really they're doing what you're telling them to do. And if you've ever visit France, one of the things you'll notice is that a lot of the city of France, a lot of the historic city, the main tourist core of the city, has a lot of buildings from the 17 and 1800s. And that's because in World War II, France was spared, right? Because of the surrender, Hitler spares Paris. He doesn't bomb Paris. He doesn't destroy the city. And so that's one of the reasons why, unlike other major European cities that had to be rebuilt after the war, Paris was untouched by the war. The Allied troops from Britain who had helped, who went, trying to stop the Blitzkrieg, they get trapped. And I don't know if some of you might have seen the movie Dunkirk that was released a couple of years ago. But the Allied troops are trapped at the port of Dunkirk. There are not enough ships to return to England, and so the British had to organize a massive evacuation. They had to evacuate 340,000 soldiers using any boat they can get a hold of, any boat that they could send. And mind you, as they're sending these boats to Dunkirk to load them, you see the soldiers, they're just sitting on the beach. Up in the city of Dunkirk, you have other British troops trying to hold off the German advances, right? But the Germans will send planes overhead. The British will fight back with planes trying to protect these soldiers. The Germans will be trying to destroy any ship that comes their way. But this becomes a very critical point in the war. The ability to evacuate that many soldiers of Dunkirk is going to make sure that Britain maintains their ability to send men to fight the war. Had this evacuation not take place, the war would have probably ended here. Another major battle is the Battle of Britain. And I'll be referencing, some different movies as I go through these slideshows, because there's tons of movies that are made about this period. It's very popular for historical movies. But another recent movie was The Imitation Game. And I don't know if anybody saw The Imitation Game, about Alan Turing and the creation of this decoding machine, or basically the computer. He invented the computer, and it starts by trying to break this decoding machine called the Enigma. So at the Battle of Britain, right, by the time Hitler launches the invasion of Britain, continental Europe is either allied with Hitler, or he has an occupying army there and a puppet government ruling them. So the only thing standing between Hitler's building of a European empire and dominating Europe is Britain. So he wants to, go now after Britain. So the Battle of Britain begins where German aircraft, the Luftwaffe, the Air Force, bombards the cities, especially London, right? 40,000 civilians are killed in London in the Battle of Britain. The British were outnumbered in the air. The British Royal Air Force had about 2,500 planes, and I think the Germans had about 4,500 aircraft. And so it was almost a 2-to-1 outnumbering of airplanes. But the British had developed the radar. Radar had not existed, and that was a secret weapon that the British had developed to detect incoming objects in the air. And they had also been working on trying to crack the code of the Enigma machine. So this machine was supposed to be a very sophisticated machine where you would type in, you would set the number, there's a dial, that little, I don't know if you see the little silver box with like 3 little kind of grooves in it. Those are 3 dials, and you would set those 3 dials, and based on those 3 dials, every letter on that board would get jumbled up within the machine. You would type a message and send it via telegram, and the person on the other end receiving the order has to know your 3-digit combination in order to decode the message. And every day that 3-number combination is reset every day. So if you were to try to write down every possible combination by hand, to crack these codes, it would probably take you about maybe 15 years. So you have to do in 15 years, what in one day, what it normally would take 15 years. In other words, it's impossible to break. It is impossible to sit there and go through every code. There's not enough time in the day because in 24 hours, it will be reset. And that's where they began to then figure out a way of creating a machine that could run different algorithms, which becomes the first computer. And that's what the movie The Imitation Game is. So once the British were able to crack the code, they were able to know where the Germans were going to be attacking. And so thanks to that development, the British were able to successfully fend off an invasion, right? The Nazis never invaded England. They launched a lot of airstrikes, but they were never able to destroy England enough to launch an invasion. Instead, in 1941, Hitler calls off the invasion, realizing it's costing him a lot of planes and a lot of lives, and Britain is not giving up. He calls off the invasion. And so he sets his eyes now on Russia. So in 1941, the Germans launch Operation Barbarossa, and the Soviet Union is caught off guard. Right? The Soviet Union was under the impression that the Germans would not attack it because they had signed the Non-Aggression Pact just 2 years before. But Hitler's plan was always to destroy communism, and that included then destroying the Soviet Union. And his plan is to enslave. He sees the people, the Slavic people of Eastern Europe, including Russia, as inferior. And he views them as people that are going to do labor for the Germans. And he's going to take land from the Poles. So they're caught off guard June 22nd, but the winter strains the German supply lines. And by 1942, the Soviets counterattack. So the Soviet strategy had been to retreat, and wait for the winter to set in. And so the Battle of Stalingrad begins to turn the tide in favor of the Soviet Union. The Blitzkrieg strategy was less effective in Russia. One, like in World War I, Russia had tremendous reserves, lots of soldiers. Hitler had underestimated the Soviet industrial capacity. Before the war, Stalin managed to move industry. Remember how fast Stalin industrialized? Well, a lot of that industry moved east of the Ural Mountains where they were safe, away from any combat. And so the Soviets were able to continue to develop weapons and artillery for the war, right? So that and the Russian winter, right, played a key role. And so that tide begins to turn, though, in 1944. So you could see by 1944, or by 1942, depending on which map you're looking at, you could see the extent of Nazi control, right? The Nazis had allied themselves with Italy. Switzerland and Spain had been neutral. It had puppet governments throughout Europe. Sweden was neutral. It controlled Hungary. It controlled Romania. It controlled Poland. It had military occupation in France. The free zones of France, Vichy France, was a puppet of Germany. So really only the United Kingdom and Russia were the lands that Germany needed to build his empire, his Third Reich. So here's where the United States comes in, right? The United States was not involved, up until 1941, right? They were not involved for the first few years of war, but they were involved by sending supplies. So before Pearl Harbor, the United States was practicing a policy of isolationism, right? But Roosevelt was selling and then, quote, loaning weapons, which is basically giving weapons and supplies to Britain, and later to the Soviets and to the Chinese that are fighting the Japanese. They're sending planes, right? And this was an unpopular move by Roosevelt. So in the United States, there was a big resistance. There was the America First Committee, right? Charles Lindbergh, the guy who our airport is named after. He was a big proponent of America First, of keeping the United States out of the war. And here you see Dr. Seuss criticizing Lindbergh in this one by, saying Lindbergh's got his head in the sand. He doesn't realize what's happening, right? Or, here in the first cartoon, what lucky thing we have separate beds, right? Because the European bed has the Italian mumps and Nazi fever and Blitzpogs and Hitleritis and Stalinich and fascist fever, right? This idea that you don't think the war is going to spread over here, like if you haven't learned from Hitler by now, you should realize that the United States should be concerned. So there's this ongoing debate between 1939 and 41 that if the United States should get involved in the war. Japan is launching invasions of Southeast Asia. They're expanding into Indochina by 1940. And the United States responds to Japan's growing aggressions in Asia by freezing its assets. And it embargoes oil. It stops sending shipments and it blocks any shipments of oil to Japan. And it demands Japan withdraw from China and from Southeast Asia. And so the Prime Minister of Japan begins to develop a plan of war for the United States. So the U.S. actions by freezing Japanese assets and embargoing the oil puts the United States in the crosshairs of Japan. And so on December 7th of 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor finally pulls the United States into the war. So the naval power of the United States in the Pacific is devastated as Pearl Harbor is attacked, and it enters the war against the Axis powers and on the side of the Allies. After Pearl Harbor, Japan continues to conquer. It conquers the Dutch East Indies, which is Indonesia. It conquers Burma, which was a British colony, Singapore, which was also British, Indochina, which was French. It conquers the Philippines, which was an ally of the U.S. It was actually, partly administered by the U.S. still. And again, the pretext of these invasions was Japan was trying to create an empire, Asia for Asians, right? Not for the Europeans that were there. But Japan was acting the same, or in many cases worse than the European imperialists were. So the United States gets involved, and the impact of the entry of the United States in the Soviet Union in 1941 are going to give the Allies the vital personnel and industry that they're going to need. So by 1942, you're going to begin to see then the war start to now balance out, right? From 39 to 42, it was Hitler pretty much building a European empire. The German submarines sank 2,452 ships. So there are over 2,452 ships buried in the ocean from World War II. And American shipyards just built more, right? So this is what also gets the United States out of the Depression, the building of ships. This leads to the growth of the West Coast. San Diego, we're a big, well, not really a big port, but we are an important port. We are the headquarters of the Navy. But there's a lot of shipbuilding that takes place up in Oakland. And there's a lot of ports up in the Long Beach area, San Pedro. So a lot of people start to move to California, right, for war industry, for war jobs. Here Rohr Industries working on airplanes is what made Chula Vista's population grow. And so there you see then a bigger alliance begins to form. After 1943, the Allies are going to begin to experience a lot of victories. Stalingrad is going to turn in favor of the Soviets in 1943, or by late 43, 44. There you see an airplane flying over the pyramids of Giza, right? 1944, the Allies invade North Africa and Italy, right, to stop their movements and to be able to gain more access to invade Europe from the south. And then Operation Overlord, which is known as D-Day, is organized in 1944. It's the invasion of France to liberate it from the Germans. And they overwhelm the Germans on the beaches, and this is what begins the liberation of France. And then once they take the beaches of Normandy, they face one more counterattack by the Nazis in France, known as the Battle of the Bulge. But after that battle, by the end of that battle, the Nazis are now retreating as the Soviet Union is invading from the east, having defeated the Germans at Stalingrad, and the Allied forces that were made up of the United States, Britain, Canada, some French freedom fighters, and their allies began to move in from the west. By May 9th of 1945, the Nazis surrendered. And so this map shows you, so if you've seen the movie Saving Private Ryan, then that takes place on the D-Day invasion. This is a map of northern France. And there's a natural harbor called Le Havre, the harbor. And if you look at the map, it's underneath the key to the map. You'll see a little port called Le Havre, and you can see a little inlet that moves into the Seine River. That's where the Germans were expecting, because if you're going to invade with a big Navy force, you're going to need some ports. And that's where you're going to invade. So that's where the Nazis were heavily waiting for the Allies. And the Allies, in fact, you see the picture at the bottom, those are men, they're not lifting up a real tank. That's an inflatable. It's a balloon. They made a whole decoy army of tanks and planes so that from the air, German spy planes would think that they're setting, that army is being shipped from England out of the port of Dover, and they're going to be heading towards the Netherlands and towards Le Havre. But the real invasion force was going into the beaches of Normandy that are very hard to reach and very unprotected. And that's why the Germans didn't really defend them as well, because they're like, you'd be stupid to invade in Normandy. There's no ports. So one of the things that happened is the British then created these gigantic blocks of concrete, and they floated them across the English Channel on barges, and then they sunk them as they got closer to the coastline to create a harbor. So the D-Day invasion was launched on the beaches of Normandy because that was the hardest place, which also made it the least defended. And that's, had they invaded at Le Havre, they would have been sitting ducks. And then that black shaded area in the middle, that's the bulge. The Germans create a bulge. They're trying to create a bulge by splitting the American and the British armies up, and if they could successfully reach the coast, or where it says Avranches, they will split up the armies and they could defeat them both. But instead, the Allies are able to hold the bulge, drive the Germans back, and after that, the Germans realize they have no more firepower left. They're gonna be in retreat for the rest of the war. In the Pacific, the tide is going to turn when the United States is able to break the Japanese code by the Battle of Midway. And Douglas MacArthur uses a strategy called island hopping to close in on Japan. Rather than going straight towards Japan, you're going to pick these islands that are the least heavily defended, because all the big islands are being defended. So you're going to waste a lot of lives and a lot of planes and ships. So instead, you're going to go to these little remote islands that have just enough land on them to land some ships and planes, and they made makeshift runways out of like corrugated metal. And so get close enough to launch airstrikes. So they use this strategy to make their way all the way to Iwo Jima and to Okinawa, which are now bigger islands right in the southern part of Japan. And they use Native American Navajos as code talkers. So there's another movie about this called Wind Talkers, if you've seen that. So in Wind Talkers, it's the story of these Navajo code talkers. They speak a language, Dene, that nobody outside of their Native American community speaks. So there's no way that it would have ever been learned by the Japanese. There's no way it would have ever been studied. So there was no way the Japanese could break that code. It remained the only code never to have been broken in war was the Navajo code. By this time, Japan is running low on supplies, and they're beginning to use kamikaze pilots to use the planes and just put enough fuel to go on a one-way bombing mission and then crash the plane into the ships in hopes of sinking it. The Okinawans refused to surrender, so the Okinawans started to arm themselves, and the United States is facing a lot of resistance. So even when the military is not doing a good job of defending the island, the Okinawans refuse to surrender. So the U.S. is convinced that Japan will not surrender. They carried out fire bombings of Tokyo. 100,000 Japanese were killed when the U.S. firebombs the city of Tokyo. And again, this is what we saw on a larger scale in World War II, is the targeting of civilians. We saw this with the Germans as they targeted civilians in London. You saw this with the Allies at Dresden when they targeted the German city of Dresden. And here, and the Germans in Poland and all the other cities they occupied. We'll talk about the Holocaust later. So atrocities towards civilians become more and more common as wars become more and more current. The Soviets agreed to enter the war against Japan. And on August 6th of 1945, the United States drops the first of 2 atomic bombs on the city of Hiroshima. The Soviet Union was supposed to invade Japan with the United States on August 15th. But before that day could come, the United States dropped an atomic bomb, and 3 days later, before they were able to assess or even give Japan time to assess the impact, they dropped the second bomb on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th. 200,000 Japanese civilians are killed in the atomic attacks. And by August 15th, the day that the Soviet Union would have entered the war, Japan surrendered. And there's a lot of controversy around that, historical controversy around that decision, and about the question of why the United States didn't wait until the Soviet invasion with them, right? Because was it to save American lives, which is part of the answer, but were they also trying to avoid the Soviet Union claiming spoils of war, right? Just because the Soviet Union is on the side of the United States, there's a lot of tension, right? And we're going to talk about that in section 4. So some scholars look at the decision as potentially a way to let Stalin know, when the war is over, you're not going to have any say in Asia. So by not letting the Soviet Union contribute to the victory, the Soviet Union can't call any shots, because that was already happening in Germany. And so you can see the devastation. These bombs just completely leveled the city. Okay, and again, that was another important characteristic of the war, is the targeting of civilian populations. So we will look at what it looked like in the home societies. So this section was about the war itself and the battles. The next one is about how total war impacts the home societies, the home fronts. Okay, so I'll see you on that lecture next.